Content warning. This episode discusses sexual violence, psychological abuse, and suicide. If these subjects are difficult for you, please take care while watching. On a winter night in 39 AD, a household in Rome stopped breathing all at once. A lantern, its glass wrapped in red cloth, was set on the threshold. Parents traded a look they had practiced for months, a face of forced calm, the hollowed-out smile of those who must perform obedience for the sake of a child. 14-year-old Flavia, hair braided with a single strand of gold, was called forward by an imperial seal. That seal was not merely ink and wax, it was an ordinance of possession. Under Caligula, the fate of Roman women was worse than death. This is a reconstructed scene, a condensation of many testimonies and fragments offered by ancient writers and by what survives in stones and letters. Flavia is a composite, a stand-in for dozens, perhaps hundreds of girls and women whose names scarcely survived the official silence. Her night becomes ours because the night repeated itself across the city and across generations. The small household visited, the purple scroll unrolled, the destiny of a girl decided in bronze ink. To understand how this could happen, how an empire that prized law, family honor, and reputation could become an instrument of intimate degradation, we must trace the man who presided over it and the institutions that made his will absolute. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was born to a household already wrapped in myth. His father, Germanicus, was the soldier adored by crowds. His lineage felt like an augury. A boy who walked among legions, who learned to be seen and cheered. The people gave him a nickname that would harden into legend, Caligula, Little Boot, and they adored the child of their hero. But adoration can teach a dangerous lesson, that affection, when mixed with power, becomes expectation. The boy who grew up in triumph also grew up watched. Grief carved deeper marks than applause. The early deaths and the threats that stalked his family taught him the fragility of favor. Under Tiberius, the imperial court hardened into something else, a school of suspicion. Caligula spent years on Capri, at the emperor's retreat, a place of ostentation beneath which paranoia spread like mold. Ancient accounts report that the court there rewarded cunning and punished subservience. Whether every anecdote is true is debated among scholars. Hostile sources exaggerated, and later historians painted the island as an incubator of cruelty. Still, the pattern is clear enough. A child raised amid triumph, then raised into fear. When Caligula became emperor, his first acts were theatrical and generous. He pardoned prisoners, returned confiscated property, staged games and feasts. For a time, he bore the mask of a benefactor. Rome breathed relief. They had hoped the dynasty of Germanicus had returned. Then, within the first year, he fell gravely ill. Ancient writers disagree about the nature of that sickness. Some suggest fever and delirium. Others imply something more complex. What is less contestable is the change that followed. He emerged from that illness altered, less a prince beloved and more an unpredictable sovereign, inclined toward extremes. Power, when it meets a mind marked by trauma, can invent new architectures of control. The transformation was not overnight, and historians still argue about its scope and origins. But the result was a court in which caprice became policy and spectacle became law. Acts that once might have seemed private took a public turn. What had been rumor, hardened into ritual. The emperor's whims were laws when the machinery of the empire enforced them. The most chilling of those mechanisms, the one that reduced noble girls to objects of display and whose very vocabulary turned people into property, was what the sources call, broadly and not always consistently, the Garden of Venus. Imagine a wing of a palace described as paradise by its architects, colonnades of marble, beds of roses, fountains that caught torchlight like spilled silver. The language of beauty was used as a mask. Behind the roses, the garden was organized like a factory of humiliation. Recruitment began with the seal. Heralds delivered purple scrolls to family homes, a name, an age, a summons. The scrolls were both honor and sentence. To refuse was to invite ruin. To accept was to be folded into a system designed to erase the self. Girls were given new names, in effect, numbers where a name once stood, titles that made them inventory rather than person. Jewelry became an instrument of control, a circlet insisted upon, not as adornment, but as a shackle whose glint proclaimed possession. Silk was not merely cloth, it was a device for exposure, for arranging the body in the public gaze. The ritualized parades, conducted before senators and officers, turned private humiliation into public theater. Rank was assigned, favor was announced with trumpets and laughter. Parents learned to applaud at ceremonies in which their daughters had been auctioned emotionally, while their hearts broke behind their public masks. This was design, not accident. The system worked by splitting the victims from one another, by converting solidarity into competition. Where sisterhood might have formed resistance, manufactured rivalries and prizes shattered it. Little kindnesses were parceled out, a token, a favor, in exchange for obedience. The aim was not only possession, but erasure, to hollow identity so thoroughly that the imperial will could move unopposed. Flavia's story follows that architecture. She is 14 when the lantern appears. Her mother irons a fold in a linen cloak. Her father tries to summon a laugh. The household is small, but their pride is large. They have married well, kept favor with patrons, and expected to survive the ebb and flow of imperial taste. For a time, Flavia believed the summons might fill her life with wonder. The palace glittered in stories. Senators boasted of amusements. The name of Caligula was spoken with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Then the first days in the garden begin with a harmless ritual, a bath scented with damask rose, a comb that shone like a soldier's breastplate. Flavia, like many, is not seized violently. She is invited into an intimacy that seems protective. That is the point of grooming, the slow softening of resistance by small favors, the teaching that the emperor's attention is desirable. Then the shifts come, an afternoon when she is singled out and given a small circle of gold, a token that glows heavier on her pulse than any jewel should. An evening when she is paraded past men who applaud and who rank her smile as if it were merchandise. The language of children reappears. She is called by a diminutive, then by a number. She learns what the cipher means without ever being allowed a word against it. The rituals are designed to isolate, small rewards for obedience, larger punishments for dissent, and a surveillance that feels absolute because it is both institutional and intimate. And then there is the slow violence of anticipation. Days filled with waiting, the most corrosive tool of all. Waiting dissolves time into a blade. Girls stand at windows and count sandals on the marble steps. They learn to read the footfall of a guard or the weight of a torch as signals. Their days become economies of hope and dread. The senses are tuned to the palace in ways that dissolve ordinary life, the way silk tears against skin, the echo of laughter in a corridor, the metallic taste that rises when a wax seal is broken. We must be careful here. The ancient sources that describe these practices combine observation, rumor, and the rhetorical fury of hostile biographers. Suetonius tells tales meant to shock. Cassius Dio offers a narrative that mixes moralizing with political analysis. Scholars debate details and emphasize that not every account is equally reliable. Yet when multiple accounts converge on a pattern, the institutionalized control of women, the use of public ritual to humiliate, the complicity of elite men, an historical image emerges that cannot be dismissed as mere slander. What made the Garden of Venus particularly effective was the complicity the state required from families and institutions. Fathers, senators, and officers were forced into a choreography of praise. A dinner in which a father lifted a cup to the emperor could also be a sentence against his daughter. The toast was both social necessity and coerced gratitude. The law and custom of Rome placed enormous weight on reputation. A father who resisted risked ruin. The military, for its part, was both protector and enforcer. The Praetorian Guard, those who ought to shield the city, could be turned into instruments of imperial will. Men who swore loyalty to the emperor found themselves swearing away the privacy of others. So how did a son of Roman glory turn into a man who treated his citizens as ornaments? The answer sits at the intersection of personal psychology and institutional possibility. Caligula's upbringing taught him two competing lessons, that the crowd makes a king and that the court will devour him if he shows weakness. The illness, the island, the adoration, all conspired to produce a ruler who celebrated spectacle and punished resistance. The machinery of empire, its courts, its guards, its social codes, provided the means. When status and force are concentrated, abuse becomes administrable. If the first parts of this story show how the system formed, the next shows how it used its instruments to maintain control. The garden was not an unstructured free-for-all. It had rules, and those rules were enforced. Girls were ranked like entries on a scroll. Their belongings were catalogued. Some were given dowries in private later, others returned hollowed and marked, their futures narrowed to matchboxes of gold. The use of jewelry, names, and parades were more than symbolic cruelty. They functioned as technology. Power needed rituals to normalize itself. When the emperor declared a girl favored, that declaration moved through the social fabric. Senators nodded, patrons adjusted alliances, husbands learned to smile in public while they writhed inside. The penalty for dissent was not only punishment, but social isolation. To speak out was to be made infamous. The psychological effects are both predictable and devastating. Those who survived the garden did not simply resume life as it had been. Many learned to dissociate, to build a mental partition between what they had to perform and who they once believed themselves to be. Some found refuge in silence. Silence became a new society, an economy of secrets with its own rules. Others, unable to live inside a body that had been publicly owned, chose to end their lives. Ancient accounts refer to suicides among the aristocratic women of the period, and modern historians treat these reports with caution. We must not fixate on method or sensationalize the act. The important fact is a scale of despair so large that it produced many private tragedies. Flavia returns to her father months later, if she returns at all. Sometimes girls came back with dowries and a new station. Sometimes they were quietly married into distant homes. Sometimes they vanished into convents and private grief. In the moments when Flavia stands again at her family's threshold, she is greeted by people who have both relieved and betrayed her. A village that celebrates a daughter brought back with coins, a father who lifts his glass and refuses to speak the name of the thing that happened. The gold is a contract of silence. The dowry is restitution that doubles as erasure. The state trades stories for stability.
Women are returned to domestic life, but their identities are forever altered. The complicity of institutions extended beyond families. Senators clenched their teeth and applauded. They rarely demanded accountability. The legal structure of Rome, preferring order, folded the emperor's crimes into his prerogative. When shame accumulated, it was often the casualties, the girls, the wives, the mothers, who bore its marks. The emperors lived above law. As one source put it, the sovereign's will could make a thing lawful by decree. When law becomes an instrument of the ruler rather than a constraint upon him, injustice acquires a veneer of legitimacy. Still, every machine of oppression contains points of friction. Those frictions produced the rage that finally toppled Caligula. Ancient accounts place the assassination in a corridor beneath the palace known as the cryptoporticus, a passage of shadowed arches and echoing steps. The details of the night are narrated differently by different authors, yet the consensus is that the emperor, exposed to conspirators within his own household, was slain by men who had been both wronged and humiliated by his excesses. Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune in sources frequently blamed as the assassin, appears in these accounts as a figure whose private indignities became public vengeance. He is not the only actor. The plot intersects senators, freedmen, and officers. The killing itself was violent and chaotic, a culmination of many grievances. For the women who had been instruments of his will, the assassination did not mean liberation. In the immediate aftermath, the palace turned to frenzy. Some of the emperor's favorites were slain in the riot that followed. Others were left in the custody of those who calculated politically. The state moved quickly to contain the damage. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, emerged from the chaos as the new emperor. He faced a simple but brutal calculus. Rome required order, and any scandal that might tear the city apart had to be smoothed over. Ancient accounts claim that Claudius's decision included the quiet trade of silence for security. Girls who had been taken returned with gifts or dowries. Their families were compensated. The state chose to pay rather than prosecute. This was not justice, it was a political decision aimed at preventing further upheaval. It subordinated the pain of victims to the needs of the polity. Scholars debate the details and degrees of these transactions, but the pattern, stability purchased at the expense of truth, is a recurring theme in imperial politics. The moral cost of that decision is heavy. When the machinery of the state chooses order over accountability, it sends a message. Some harms are the price of peace. The women who received gold in exchange for their silence bore the legacy privately. Their stories, if they survived at all in letters or household memory, were folded out of public view. The archive of empire keeps its triumphs and its laws. It does not keep the names of everyone who suffered. Thus, memory becomes selective, and the silence about certain injuries is institutionalized. This is where the phrase "worse than death" gains its force. Death ends suffering in a single painful instant. What the garden and the imperial system enacted on these women was a life turned into a public ledger of shame, a fate in which personhood was incrementally stripped away. To be coerced into compliance is to be forced into a performative existence, where the self is constantly judged and never trusted.
For many, living with that memory was a slow and persistent death of possibility. Marriages dissolved, alliances shifted, children born into stigma. The cruelty was not merely in a single act, but in the way that the state's mechanisms extended over years, shaping social relations, family reputations, and legal outcomes. It bears repeating that the historical record is not a single, reliable mirror. Ancient sources are colored by the politics of their authors, and modern historians must read them with a critical eye. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio wrote with moral aims and rhetorical flourishes. Some claims might be exaggerations, others may be fragments of truth amplified by outrage. Historians reconstruct these events by triangulating sources, archaeology, coinage, letters, and the biases of each chronicler. Where accounts contradict, scholars debate. Where details fit a larger pattern, cautious consensus can form. The larger lesson, however, does not depend on the exact count of victims or the precise phrasing of a decree. The structural truth remains. Concentrated, unchecked power created spaces in which private humiliation could be normalized and sheltered by law. We should also note the ways the elite folded those crimes into their own survival. Men who participated as spectators or enforcers were not merely collaborators, they were co-architects of a culture that rewarded silence and absolute loyalty. The social penalties for defiance were severe, and the incentives for obedience were material and reputational. The emperor's patronage could make a fortune, his displeasure could erase a family's standing. Thus complicity was both coerced and chosen. That ambiguity complicates moral judgments, but it also sharpens our understanding of how institutions enable abuse by creating asymmetric incentives. When we think of the aftermath, we must imagine what it felt like to return to a world that had not been rebuilt around the experience of the victims. Flavia, if she came back, would find a city continuing its rituals and markets, senators moving through marble halls as if nothing had changed. She would find, perhaps, a marriage arranged by her family to tuck her into anonymity, or a dowry that bought her silence. She would find a society that rewarded forgetfulness. That social forgetting is itself an act of violence. And yet memory persists in small places. Unsent letters tucked into a drawer, the way a mother refuses to speak her daughter's name, the tremor in a father's hand when he lifts his cup. Historiography, for all its limits, tries to catch those margins. Scholars dedicate pages to fragments precisely to recover the human cost that official narratives efface. When we read ancient accounts that rage or weep, we owe them the benefit of careful listening, to separate polemic from testimony, to honor survivors' experiences without turning them into spectacle. There is also a broader lesson here about governance. The Garden of Venus was not an anomaly, but an extreme example of a recurrent problem. When power is concentrated in one person and legal institutions subservient, personal depravity can become public policy. Mechanisms of accountability, independent courts, a political culture that allows dissent, institutional constraints on the ruler are not merely procedural niceties, they are shields for the vulnerable. Where those shields are removed, abuses can be institutionalized, and personal cruelties can metastasize into systems. At the same time, we must resist reducing the past to a simple moral fable. The Roman world was complex. Many citizens resented Caligula, others remained loyal, and many did not have access to the corridors where these horrors took place. The story we tell is partial by necessity, reconstructed from biased and fragmentary evidence. Yet the outlines of cruelty and complicity make a compelling, if distressing, narrative. Wealthy girls reduced to entries on admiralty lists of favor. Fathers made to toast the system that had harmed their kin. A city choosing stability over truth. In the silence that followed, the stories of women like Flavia survive only in edges. We must decide whether to look at those edges. Remembering is not merely an act of pity, it is a political and moral choice. It insists that institutions be judged by what they protect and by what they permit. It asks modern readers to consider how systems, legal, social, cultural, can shelter power at the cost of the vulnerable. If hidden horrors of the past interest you, subscribe to Grim History. After the assassination and the pragmatic cover-up, the longer arc of consequences settled in. Some women married into quieter lives, their names restored on household epitaphs without explanation. Others withdrew from public visibility and lived out their days in the domestic sphere, carrying the memory like an ache. Some became figures of rumor, their stories used as moral exempla about the dangers of imperial whim. The trauma did not evaporate with time, it passed into family lore.
Children inherited reputations. Reputations shaped futures. The scars were not always visible, but they were enduring. What can we learn from the specifics of this Roman episode? First, that ritual can become a technology of control. When ceremony is weaponized, it normalizes abuse, giving cruelty a patina of legitimacy. Second, that complicity is often a system problem more than a failure of individual conscience. People inside hierarchies make choices under pressure and incentive. Those choices create systemic outcomes. Third, that memory matters. When a society decides not to investigate, when it prioritizes tranquility over truth, it consigns survivors to silence and allows injustice to calcify into tradition. And finally, a caution. We must guard against the temptation to treat these past horrors as merely exotic. The mechanisms, grooming, normalizing public spectacle, coercive exchange of silence for security, have echoes in other times and places. Power without checks tends to invent new means to claim bodies and silence protest. Recognizing the pattern is not to moralize about modern actors, but to be vigilant about institutional design, to ensure that law protects privacy, that courts are independent, and that honor is not used as a tool to conceal crimes. Flavia's lantern is a stubborn image. The red glass catches torchlight and makes shame visible. It shows how a society can mark someone as property with a simple, everyday object. That image is a reminder that history's margins are populated by people whose lives were shaped by decisions made in rooms of marble and purple. It is a reminder that when the state treats people as inventory, dignity is the first casualty. In the end, to call the fate of these women worse than death is to insist on the value of autonomy and naming. Death is a tragic end. The thing that makes life unbearable is the stripping of the right to be recognized as a person. Names matter. To be reduced to a number, to have your dignity used as social currency, to be returned with coins in exchange for silence, these are harms that outlast a single season.
Historians will continue to debate the particulars of Caligula's reign. They will argue about which stories are exaggeration and which are accurate. They will sift the rhetorical flourishes from administrative records. But the broader warning stands. When a polity places one man above law and makes spectacle the basis of politics, it endangers the most vulnerable among it. The cost is human, and it lingers. Flavia, as we have told her, is composite. She gathers together fragments and testimonies so that those who survived may be seen in narrative form. Naming her in this way is an act of remembrance. Acknowledging her composite nature is an act of historical caution. She is not a fabrication meant for entertainment. She is a vessel for many forgotten voices. We close, then, with a choice that is as moral as it is historical. We can ignore the margins on the grounds that stability required silence. Or we can listen, try to recover the unsaid, and allow memory to be a corrective to power. To remember is to refuse the trade that Claudius's pragmatism offered, peace purchased with erasure. If you found this account meaningful, share it with someone who cares about the hidden costs of power. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Grim History for more reconstructions that listen to the margins of the past. Remember the lanterns, the silk, the sandals on marble. Remember the names we can still recover, and ask who else might have been silenced.